Welcome back to Deb's True Crime Notebook. This is day 18 in the Richard Allen trial, and we've heard the prosecution's closing arguments. We will now review the defense's closing arguments. Let's get right into it. 10:42 a.m. The court resumes, and defense attorney Brad Rozzi starts his closing argument. Rozzi reminds the jury that they have been present for nearly a month, reviewing 17 days of evidence. The defense believes in what you've heard over the last few weeks, he states. Rozzi outlines 4 primary themes: broken timeline, bumbled ballistics, false confessions, and digital forensics. He informs the jury that the state has created a narrative of what they don't want you to hear is what we had to tell you. Rozzi emphasized, we had to do their job. He elaborates by mentioning that the state declined to conduct a height analysis on Bridge Guy. He also notes that the hours of videos interviews from 2016 have gone missing. Rozzi points out that the state only investigated a detail about the Ford Focus after a juror inquired about it during the trial, specifically asking if it was the only 2016 black Ford Focus registered in 2017. Rozzi begins detailing witness testimony, noting that Brad Heath remarked on seeing an unusual man that day. He argues that Betsy Blair's testimony fails to present the complete picture. Rozzi expresses, I need to take a breath before discussing this. When mentioning Sarah Carbaugh, he claims that Carbaugh confused muddy with bloody. He advises the jury that he might dismiss a witness referring to it as credible dubiosity, and indicates that they have the option to discredit Carbaugh. Rozzi asserts that the prosecution omitted details about David McCain, Shelby Hicks, and Cheyenne Mill because it doesn't fit their narrative. He informs the jury that the prosecution also left out Allen's timeline of how he reached the bridge, to which Allen nodded in agreement in the courtroom. Rozzi encourages the jury to rely on 2 pieces of evidence for common sense: the interviews conducted on October 13th and 26th of 2022. He concludes by stating that Brad Weber's gun cannot be dismissed as one that cycled the cartridge discovered at the scene. Rozzi points out that Weber had sticks stored in his garage, a detail the state failed to mention. He notes that Weber's account changed since February 13th. Rozzi also discusses phone calls from April 3rd, 2023, which the state overlooked entirely. He highlights that the state did not provide information regarding the FBI's departure from the investigation and mentions that the sticks found on the girls' bodies were not collected. Rozzi references the Westville videos of Allen, asserting that Allen was kept in solitary confinement without any human interaction. He claims that the state only wants the jury to hear select words. Rozzi argues that the magic bullet constitutes the core of the state's case, insisting that the prosecution seeks to persuade the jury to trust Oberg while disregarding the lack of photographic evidence. Use your common sense, he urges. Rozzi further states that the state did not mention Libby's phone being connected to an accessory, presenting the jury with a timeline of the phone's activity. You should question their credibility, he asserts, directing his comments at the prosecution, and emphasizes that the state was eager to make an arrest. Rozzi informs the jury that Brad Weber's van detail was only introduced this year, noting that it took 7 years for hair and DNA testing to be completed. He argues that Allen's Google searches provided no evidence that Allen himself conducted them, as they are merely linked to his email account. Rozzi describes the Google search information presented by forensic examiner Chris Cecil as offering the jury last food. He also points out that Dr. Roland Kaur, who conducted the autopsies on the girls, stated in a deposition that there might have been multiple murder weapons, but has since indicated it could be a box cutter. Rozzi mentions that this statement came after Kaur met the prosecution 3 times. Finally, he urges the jury to take into account that Carbaugh did not witness anything. He points out that the state has only a few crucial moments in their timeline: February 13th at 2:13 p.m. when the Bridge Guy video was recorded, February 13th at 3:56 p.m. when Carbaugh observes a man walking on 300 North. Rozzi dismisses Carbaugh's testimony as worthless. He claims Abby could have survived for 5 to 10 minutes and might have screamed, yet no one recorded or reported hearing any screams. Rosie argues that the state overlooked the possibility of more than one perpetrator and failed to consider that someone could have accessed the bridge from the south side. He contends that the state posts the crime was labor-intensive and executed by a 5'5" individual, leaving no evidence, all within a brief time frame. He states it's just implausible. Rosie informs the jury that Allen approached law enforcement following the murders in 2017 and remained cooperative in 2022, even after learning he was considered a suspect. Rosie states, even in the face of falsehoods, Allen remained resilient. He emphasizes that Allen was a member of the community and had no reason to flee, as he was innocent. Rosie highlights the forensic analysis conducted by Oberg on the cartridge discovered at the scene, noting that Oberg's examination did not reveal sufficient agreement between the cartridge found and the one tested. He argues that the jury should primarily focus on the photographs from the cartridge testing, as they highlight the lack of agreement. Rosie mentions that Oberg suggested, "You should just believe me." He claims that the state refrained from having the cartridge reevaluated due to the terrible quality of Oberg's work. He asserts that Allen's situation in this case is unprecedented, particularly referring to his solitary confinement. He states that Allen spent 13 months in solitary confinement and questions how much can one man endure. Rosie expresses that it was disrespectful for the state to prevent the jury from viewing video footage of Allen in Westville. He asserts that Allen was not pretending, and even Dr. Walla and Dr. Martin indicated uncertainty about his authenticity. Rosie mentions that the Indiana Department of Corrections medical standard was merely to keep Allen alive. He urges the jury, "You should feel insulted." Rosie explains that Allen experienced false memories during certain confessions and claims the state misrepresented information regarding Libby's phone. He notes that the phone was active between 5:45 p.m. and 10:32 p.m. on February 13th, and that something was plugged into it during that time frame. Rosie informs the jury that there's no trace evidence linking Allen to the crime scene. He notes that Dr. Polly Westcott, a neuropsychologist, observed that Dr. Walla's notes resemble a narrative rather than a coherent account, despite Allen's psychotic state. Rosie points out that the state appeared eager to interpret the sound in the Bridge Guy video as the sound of a handgun being racked. He raises the question of whether the girls' bodies were present at the scene during the evening of February 13, 2017. Additionally, he mentions that the Smith & Wesson cartridge discovered in the memory box is a common brand. Lastly, Rosie states that while Allen found God during his time alone in a cell with only a Bible, that is not the reason for his confession. Rosie presents the jury with 5 key points to consider. No one has identified Allen as Bridge Guy. There is no digital evidence linking Allen to the crime. There is no clothing that connects Allen. No DNA ties Allen to the case. No trace materials associate Allen with the innocent. Rosie expresses sympathy for the families of the girls, acknowledging that the lengthy journey they have endured. He asserts at the end of the day, the state's timeline has fallen apart. The magic bullet is simply a tragic bullet. He then displays an image of a rack, a medieval torture device, followed by a photo of a thumbscrew, emphasizing that these instruments are reminiscent of what Allen faced in solitary confinement. Rosie notes that while these tools have evolved, their essence remains the same. Rosie then presents 4 images of Allen in prison where he is covered in feces and being dragged while wearing a spit hood. During the display of the photos, Allen turns his gaze away, while his wife Kathy is seen crying. Rosie remarks, rendering a verdict of guilt could be endorsing this behavior. He urges the jury to acquit Allen. After speaking for an hour and 17 minutes, Rosie concludes his argument at 12 p.m. And that concludes the defense's closing statements. We'll see you next time on Deb's True Crime Notebook.